ghosts and elementals. Did you know there is scientific evidence for what for all intents and purposes would be considered magic? Join me for another P4P Proof of the Paranormal in what is already the 47th episode of I'm Just Gonna Say It, as I show you how magical science can get in today's episode, the Science of Magick. It is kind of a special episode as I'm going to interview one of the biggest contributors to parapsychological research at the moment. After spending his younger years playing the violin, he started studying electrical engineering but later gravitated towards psychology and parapsychology. Yes, I am talking about Dean Radin. Here we go. Dean Radin is one of the most prolific researchers in the field of parapsychology at the moment. He is chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, or IONS, in Petaluma, California. IONS was founded by Apollo Astronaut Edgar Mitchell, whose name you might remember from episodes of Evidence for Extraterrestrials. Dean Radin's latest book, after writing The Conscious Universe and Entangled Minds, among others, is entitled Real Magic: Ancient Wisdom, Modern Science, and a Guide to the Secret Power of the Universe. Having a great interest and a good deal of practical experience with occult philosophy myself, I interview him on what science has to say about the magical paradigm. Links to a lot of his experiments can be found in the description. Let's not waste any more time while I welcome to the show Dr. Dean Radin. Dean, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you here, and good to see you again. Last time we had a chance to chat was back in 2013 at IONS in Petaluma. I remember the double slit setup you showed me in the shielded chamber, which I think people were trying to influence via an online experiment, if I remember correctly. A perfect example of something that for all intents and purposes could be called magic. So this interview is also in relation to your most recent book called Real Magic: Ancient Wisdom, Modern Science, and a Guide to the Secret Power of the Universe, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading, by the way. I'll make sure to post a link in the description so everyone at home can pick up a copy. Now let's start at the very bottom today, Dean. I suspect I already know the answer to this question, but it's an important place to start nonetheless. So now I consider myself to be a full-fledged idealist. I actually see the fact that materialism describes our physical universe so well as evidence supporting idealism in a way. On a planet with mostly materialists, after all, a materialist reality will be what to expect. I have often enjoyed entertaining the idea that maybe molecules did not exist until man invented a microscope to see them, although I'm fully aware that ignores the fact that we're probably not the only minds in the universe. But anyway, my question is, kind of coming at it from both sides, both as a scientist and as someone with an esoteric interest. Do you consider yourself to be an idealist or a materialist? And is that based more on personal experience or on what you have learned and observed in the lab, so to speak?
The answer is yes. I, of course, as a scientist, was trained in materialism, and I think it would be wise to not throw that out because it's been very successful as a doctrine. On the other hand, it doesn't deal with consciousness very well at all. In fact, people who are hardcore materialists will deny the existence of consciousness, which seems silly to me.
Yes.
So while every second Tuesday I'm a full-blown idealist with a capital I, and every second Thursday I'm more inclined towards something like neutral monism or dual aspect theory. And it's partially because I can make a case to myself that idealism is the way to go. On the other hand, though, the way that I view it is possibly slightly different than the way it's usually thought of in idealism, and it's closer to neutral monism, in the sense that, as I describe in my book Real Magic, that if you carve up the physical world into hierarchies of disciplines, with physics on the bottom of this hierarchy, then our disciplines and the way we carve up the universe is essentially a set of assumptions. Well, we just add a new assumption underneath physics, which is consciousness. It becomes more fundamental than all of the rest. in which case the physical universe is emerging somehow out of consciousness. But once it emerges, it has properties of its own. So one of the reasons why science has been successful is because those properties are stable enough, at least on the Earth at this point in history, for science to have made advancements to the point where we have technologies that allow us to do this interview.
Couldn't agree more. And I'm not surprised either by your answer. I always took you for something of an idealist. Now, I want to tell you about this period of 2 weeks I experienced about 2 years ago, where basically everything I tried when it comes to magic stuff seemed to work. It happened after I tried to manifest a person with certain qualities for about 2 weeks at that moment, and then such a person actually appeared. This strengthened my belief in my abilities to manifest to such a degree that I even experienced spontaneous macro PK, both controlled and uncontrolled, for those 2 weeks. Unfortunately, as sudden as it appeared, it also left me again. Have you heard about instances like that before?
Yeah, and I've had a few experiences like that. I think one of the reasons they may go away is because after a while we begin to doubt ourselves. We doubt the experiences even. And in particular, we try to analytically figure out how did that happen? And in addition, it's a little bit frightening because if we imagine that our whims get turned into in the world at large, that would be very, very bad because generally, most people don't have very good control of their urges. And so in a larger sense, if this was a force that was unleashed, that would destroy everything pretty quickly. So it's probably a good idea that there are brakes or governors that are holding back our ability to manipulate reality so easily.
Yeah, indeed. I think belief in the ability is the main factor there, and well, that is mostly strengthened by experience, of course, and also weakened by basically your whole life of experience to the contrary in most people's cases.
Right. So some of it is belief, yeah, and some of it is probably motivation. Some of it is need, which is a little bit more intense than simply motivation. And some of it may also be, for all we know, the consciousness of the planet and the geocosmic variables and all kinds of other things that may come into play to provide little windows where it all comes together. And then, as you said, for a period of 2 weeks or so, it's like real magic happening.
It definitely is. So before we get into the deeper questions for the viewers who are basically totally new to the topic, could you give a short 101 on the concept of the science behind magic and on how science in general and parapsychology in particular on the one hand and magic on the other are basically two ways of looking at the same thing?
So when you look at the esoteric traditions, either in the East or in the West, they're all essentially based on idealism, the idea that consciousness is fundamental. When you look at the practices that are based on that, what amounts to a theory, it's kind of the esoteric traditions, just like science, are based on theoretical assumptions. If you look at the practices that are associated with esoteric beliefs, you find three that are said again and again, different cultures. You have divination, which is perceiving through space and time. You have force of will, which is about spell casting or casting your intention into the world with the intention of changing it. And you have theurgy, which is the idea that there are independent, intelligent spirits of various sorts out there that you can communicate with. So from an idealist perspective or an esoteric perspective, the reason why these things work is because ultimately everything that we experience comes out of consciousness, in which case, since the physical world too, including concepts like space and time, are emerging out of consciousness, and we are consciousness because we emerge out of it as well. I use this term of consciousness with a capital C and consciousness with a small c to make the distinction between consciousness with a large C being universal, simply part of the fabric of reality, consciousness with a small c being what you call me, or what you refer to as I. And that little c and big C are identical. We don't usually feel it as being identical, but in mystical states, that's what people report. So if we have the same creative power as the universal consciousness, but perhaps to a smaller degree, then force of will makes sense because we can make things emerge just from manipulation of our own consciousness. The idea of theurgy makes sense because if consciousness permeates everything, then there may be an infinite number of forms in which consciousness can exist in an embodied way. So some of those embodiments we might be able to see, like ourselves, and some we may not be able to perceive because our senses don't pick them up, but maybe mediums do see them. And other people who are sensitive can see things like fairies and sprites and all kinds of things that are part of legend. And then when it comes to divination, the reason why we can see through space and time is because part of our consciousness is not in space or time. It is prior to space-time, in which case our ability to perceive comes before the constraints of physics.
Yes.
So that's from the esoteric perspective about why magic works. On the scientific side, what psi research has always been looking at is the experiences that people report, which include perception through space and time. We call it clairvoyance and precognition. Lots of experiments saying those are real things. We study force of will in the form of psychokinesis, which is mind-matter interactions. Again, lots of evidence. And we study ideas about theurgy primarily as mediumship studies, where you can do it under controlled conditions. And then less than controlled conditions, things like reincarnation and near-death experience and a couple of other categories. The evidence there that there actually are independent spirits is not so good. The stories, there are a lot of stories about it, but from a scientific perspective, that domain of magic is not as well set because it's very difficult to do controlled experiments. So that's how, from an esoteric perspective, which is not within science at all, you have an enormous amount of lore and practice about magic. From a scientific perspective, we have good evidence now that at least some of the magical practices are in fact real.
Yeah. Technology is helping us there more and more. Also, I think, for instance, tech that tries to help us see spirits and stuff. I know there are some experiments with this device from, I think it was Sony or PlayStation or whatever, the Kinetic. That's actually a device that is used to like map a skeletal figure in space when you're playing a game over your actual body. And people started noticing that it was mapping figures on empty space sometimes. It makes sense, I guess. And actually people are reporting the same thing with Snapchat, where you can superimpose filters on your face. And some people are reporting that those filters are appearing where there are no faces. A group of guys developed this Kinetic device into a ghost hunting tool.
Yeah, so that fits in with within the area of EVP and ITC, electronic voice phenomena and instrumental transcommunication, of which as soon as there were any kind of instruments at all, going all the way back to Bell inventing the phonograph, there were claims that sometimes technology behaves in ways that suggest that there's some independent thing interfering with it, at least. I would say again, in most cases, if not all, it's very difficult to do controlled experiments with those kinds of technologies. So we again can't have very high confidence that they are what they appear to be.
Yeah, that's the problem indeed. Although we do have, of course, video footage of it being used, but still, that's debatable, of course.
Yeah, and more importantly, it's typically spontaneous, right? You can't cause these things to happen on demand, which is what is required
in the lab,
in doing cyber experiments.
Now, as I mentioned to you recently, I've started the self-initiation process into the Golden Dawn system of ceremonial magic, just to experience what is going on as an experiment of sorts. I'm not saying the subject doesn't fascinate me as well, because it does, but I entered into it trying not to have any preconceived notions, basically, as a scientist. This after 2 years of just reading a lot of grimoires and other literature, as well as doing some experiments with sigil magic and with evocation as well. I have a habit of jumping into the deep end, which is not always the responsible thing to do, especially in this case. But I won't go into detail, but enough weirdness ensued that it got me reconsidering my strategy, so to speak, which led me to the whole self-initiation thing. It's basically a lot of daily ritual work and meditation exercises. And the final goal is conversing with what the Golden Dawn refers to as your holy guardian angel. I suspect this means your higher self or superego, as Freud would say. Now, in the beginning, when you're doing this ritual stuff, sometimes you're really thinking like, "What the f am I doing?" But persistently, supposedly, is key there. So, and for some reason, after a while, it did start to affect me in ways, as I was told before, that it didn't seem to make sense from a logical perspective. But when looking at the symbolism behind it, it does make some sense. I suspect the same mechanism underlies sigil magic. The point I'm trying to make is that it seems that symbols are kind of the language of the universe, at least on this plane of existence. Israel Regardie, in his book on the Tree of Life, even goes so far as to say that the symbols might be just symbols on this plane of existence, but represent actual entities on the astral plane. Adding to that creating a sigil is akin to creating an astral entity. So my next question is, what is your view on this and on the role of symbolism in most, if not all, types of magical practice?
Well, again, as I discuss in Real Magic, at the leading edge of mathematics and physics, and even quantum physics, the thought leaders are beginning to say that information or mathematics is more fundamental than our concepts about particles and that sort of thing. And it's true. You look at something like string theory or most sophisticated form of particle theories, it's all mathematics at this point. Because in many cases, we maybe can detect some of these particles that are theoretically described in mathematics, like the Higgs boson took many trillions of samples in order to be able to find something that sort of looked like what was expected, even though it wasn't exactly what was expected.
Yeah.
What that suggests is that if you take information as a fundamental and you think of what we do as humans, we are information processors. That's a way to think of what the brain is doing. It's processing information. Well, how do we do that? Well, we process it in symbolic terms. All of our language, spoken and written, it's all symbolic ways of encoding information. So whether we use the terms symbols or information in a formal sense or in an informal sense, I mean like Shannon information and other forms of information or mathematical ways of capturing those concepts, it does seem to have something to do with symbols. And so it's true, you go back into things like the Kabbalah, and the Kabbalah says, well, we are constructed out of an alphabet of 26 letters and 10 numbers. Yeah. Literally symbols. So whether that is true or not, maybe at the time when the Kabbalah was being developed, that was about as close as somebody could come to describing information or complex forms of information. And it's interesting, at least, that at the leading edge of science now, that we're coming back to a description of reality, which is far less in terms of material and far more in terms of informational concepts. So maybe the grimoires, which were suggesting that this symbol means something literally, is actually closer to the truth than what we were thinking about 100 years ago in physics.
Yeah, exactly. And more people are saying these days that numbers aren't concepts, but actual things, basically, which make up reality.
Yeah, well, I mean, that this is all what the Platonic forms are all about as well.
Yeah.
That there are fundamental forms, shapes, either geometries. This, of course, is where sacred geometry comes from, possibly.
Are you familiar with the work of Marco Rodin and on Vortex Mathematics?
Oh, well, not that particular name, but I'm aware of people are looking into vortex and torsion physics. So I'm aware of some of that, but oftentimes what I see happening in those areas is that it spins off, not to use a pun, but it spins off into covering every esoteric thing you've ever heard of in a way where I'm not entirely clear that the jumps of logic that are made are actually valid.
Yeah, true. That's a mistake you see more often also with quantum mechanics, I think, that people tend to generalize the micro to the bigger domains.
Yeah, well, it's not just micro to macro, because at least within quantum mechanics, there's a pretty good evidence that there are things like macro entanglement, so that's a real thing. But rather that it spins out to include a description of everything in the entire universe. That's a leap of faith. And one of the reasons why I'm an appearancist rather than a theoretician is while we absolutely need theory in order to help understand what we're dealing with and to devise new experiments, in my experience, most people who have fallen in love with their theory begin to perceive everything through that lens. And they may or may not be correct, in which case most of the time you're not correct because we don't have explanations for everything. But the theory becomes a blinder. So I prefer to rely on data rather than theory. And of course, it's not possible to be completely data-driven because you have to have ideas about what you're doing, and those are proto-theoretical, but I'm not basing what I do on theoretical grounds.
Now that's interesting, and I agree with that. And indeed, preconceived notions can definitely limit your perception. It's a well-known phenomenon within psychology, bias and stuff. Now, after a couple of years of reading and practicing magic, I can't escape the conclusion myself that, putting evocation and invocation aside for a moment, that magic and all the elaborate rituals and rules that are involved are mostly tools to fool or convince yourself, or your subconscious anyway, that what you're doing is working and that what you're asking for is really going to happen. The Golden Dawn also states that the theoretical end goal is a state where you don't even need the rituals and rites anymore, but then just manifest thought, basically. When discussing idealism with people, for instance, you often hear, well, if it works, then why aren't the bags of money appearing in front of me? To which the obvious answer is, well, you don't really believe in it, I guess. An example I often give to people is that if everyone on Earth would believe at the same time that humans can fly, I'm certain we would take off just like that. However, people underestimate how difficult it is to hold such a belief, to truly hold it. Because if it means you truly believe you can fly, you would step off the Hoover Dam without any hesitation after all.
Well, we are embodied organisms. And as an embodied creature, we are subject to limitations in the physical world, and we are reminded of that constantly. So at a deep, unconscious level, we probably identify with the body. In fact, I'm sure we do. And as a result, the moment you start thinking about miracles and magic, it's very difficult to overcome the limitations of our unconscious beliefs. In fact, it may not just be limitations, it may be actual. Like in order to truly fly as like a Superman, like a physical body is flying, it may be possible because historically there certainly looked like there are cases where people were at least levitating, but they're very unusual people. Like they're not normal people by any stretch of the imagination, in which case, if you want to be a relatively normal person living in society, well-grounded and all the rest of it, you have already absorbed a huge amount of what culture demands as this is real. This is the way things are. And to overcome that, you either need to dive into the rituals and tweak your belief, at least a little bit, or do basically what I do, which is meditation, which is kind of a ritual. It's all about getting your mind to go become quiet and get out of the way. And so that's from a magician gets into the gnosis state, and a yogi gets into samadhi. And that's where all of these magical practices originate. It's not from any ordinary state. So one of the responses then is to why are you not surrounded by blocks of gold that you wish to manifest? It may well be that in your conscious state you would like that, but that's not where these things come from. If you dive deeply into the gnosis state or some other similar state, from that perspective, the idea of becoming rich based on an ability to manifest thing would be laughable. Yeah, or maybe exactly. It wouldn't even be something that you would be interested in. It's like not even a thing. And partially because in that state, as in most mystical states, the idea of physicality itself begins to get pushed into the background. Like you begin to recognize that that's not really what we're here for or what we should strive toward, in which case it becomes meaningless. So the closest I can think of this as an analogy is the one time I took ecstasy, MDMA.
Mm-hmm.
And as a scientist, I wanted to write in a diary before, during, and after. So I'd kind of trace the mental state. So I took the pill, and then I'm writing in 5 minutes, I don't feel anything. In 10 minutes, maybe I feel something. 15 minutes, I'm feeling a little queasy. 20 minutes, I wrote, this is not a placebo, because it hit.
Yeah.
And after that, there's no entries. Because once you're in that state, the idea of maintaining an analytical dispassion, it just completely dissolves. And I kind of suspect that it'd be something like that. If you're able to snap into a gnosis state, then winning at the casino and things like that are totally meaningless.
True, true. Well, except maybe if you connect that to a higher goal, of course, of helping humanity or whatever.
Well, and then there are stories. I mean, I know people who consistently win even at machines like slot machines, where there's no strategy. The only thing you can do is show up at the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
And so I heard stories where this guy has won millions of dollars, and I didn't completely believe it because that sounds ridiculous. I mean, his description is he would get an urge to go to a casino and to go to a particular slot machine, and he would play it with $1 or $2 coins, and he would win, and then he would leave. And this happened again and again and again. And then he showed me the receipts of these, a big pile, like 100 or more receipts of all of these winnings. Each one's around $10,000 or so, but it adds up. So he was doing it in that case because his initial job, basically was to be a cook on cruise ships, and they would only go out about 3 or 4 months a year, and then he got the rest of the money and just to live for living expenses. So he wasn't being greedy about it. He decided, oh, the rent is due. I think I'll go to this casino. He'll get the money to pay for it, and then that's that.
Interesting. That should get the casinos coming after you, though. But
well, fortunately, this was in California, where he's able to go to a number of different Indian casinos.
That helps.
And so he's able to keep going to different places, and they don't pay that much attention if you win occasionally. And also, he wasn't playing table games, right? Because they get really concerned at table games if you're cheating, but you can't cheat at a slot machine.
No, that's true, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I do remember some experiments where they are predicting the color a roulette wheel would fall upon, for instance, and they got in trouble pretty quickly as well. But that's a table game, of course. Do you have any personal experience yourself with ceremonial or other types of magic?
I would say no. No, I haven't done ceremonial magic, but that's because my personality is from very early on was trained to regard any kind of religious ritual with enormous suspicion, because internally I felt that this is a way to brainwash me, essentially. Like, it's go along with this meaningless thing happening. So I absorbed that at an early age, and so I never wanted to do anything like that, and I haven't. My own approach to this is through meditation. Almost all of that is personal practice. So I don't go places and meditate with groups and so on, because that also feels a little bit like I'm being pulled into a ritual or a cult, and I strongly resist that.
Yeah, well, I kind of share that sentiment actually, especially from youth on. I've always had almost a disdain even of organized religion, but I don't know, somehow I got lured into this, and I must say the results kind of surprised me and upturned my whole worldview a little bit. But I guess that's the whole point of it. So
I don't have any doubt that rituals work. Maybe not to the extent that we see in the movies, of course, but they work in the same way that if you have a practice that's been going on for 10 or 20,000 years, and it continues to go on, there's something important about groups of people doing something together with some meaning. And even though I don't tend to gravitate towards groups of meditation, on occasion I will be in a group, small or large, that has people who are more practiced in meditation than I am, and it feels completely different. Like I get into a much deeper state, much faster in an experienced group than I can on my own.
Yeah, they seem to
So
drag you along or something. I know what you mean, definitely. There.
yeah, it creates something, an attractor or something that pulls you into that space, and it's dramatic. And so actually, one of the reasons I avoid it is because I don't want to get sucked into that whirlpool, right? I mean, it at the time it might feel okay because you're getting into this very deep state. It also starts, my red flags start picking up, and the red flags are saying you're getting pulled along a current where you don't have much control.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe it's simply a matter of I want more internal control about what's happening. So personal, private meditation feels better to me.
Yeah, I can imagine that's more at the right pace, so to speak, and stuff happens when it's supposed to happen instead of too soon, which definitely can be a danger, I think.
Right.
I think stuff like that, psychosis might even relate to it. People say genius and psychosis are closely related after all.
Well, I've spoken to meditation teachers who say that on average between maybe 2 to 5% of people who go to a meditation retreat who haven't done very much meditation, they will have a psychotic break.
Interesting, yeah.
So, for 95 to 98% of the people, it's perfectly fine, but some people simply can't take it.
Yeah, well, it would make sense. It can indeed be quite intense. I can testify to that. And I did years of meditation as well, so I know where you're coming from. But it has been good but intense. In the beginning, it really messed with the scientist in me, in a way, all those esoteric truths. Later, I just took it as an extreme confirmation of a mental universe. But a good example would be egregors. Are you familiar with the term?
The creatures?
Yeah, the
egregores?
thought form, yeah.
Yeah.
But because they are a nice example of this, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that aside from that, there are also actual non-human entities that seem to exist outside of time even, but even they could be a product of the mass belief in them, of course, from our sides, and seeing them as timeless, thus making it so. Or they could actually exist separate from us, which brings us to evocation and invocation. Now, evocation and invocation of angels and demons, or daimons, is today generally seen as evil and wicked, and even crazy, depending on who you ask. I think that is one of the main reasons why I also try to stay away from those terms, because of the obvious religious connotations. But demons, linguistically and phenomenologically speaking, evolved from daimons. The Greeks and even Egyptians already spoke of them, looking at them as neither good nor evil, I think, more as agents of faith, and things you call upon when you're in need of help from above. It's not until the Christian church got involved, insisting that there was only one God, that all other figures were, well, quite literally demonized. So that is looking at the history part. From a physics and a modern day perspective, and multidimensional theory in particular, I would dare state that, assuming there are multiple dimensions invisible to our naked eye, it would be fair to make the same assumption about the probable inhabitants of those dimensions, right? Building up to the next question, I want to read you this bit from a pretty contemporary grimoire on black magic called the Book of Azazel, where the demon Azazel is quoted to have said the following. I am the formed abyss. We are not different, you and I. All things are formed from one primordial nothingness. Not at some point in the distant past, but in each moment, every moment that you consider me, I come into being. Every moment that you consider yourself, you are brought into existence. Stop considering yourself, and you will cease to be. I have appeared to men as they have considered me. I taught them that which they were on the brink of learning themselves. I concatenated their realizations. I would say that I have always existed as this Promethean, Pandorian figure, because all time for me is present. However, I have not existed at all until this moment, but neither have you. The questioner then asks, where does this leave the idea of our objective reality? To which the answer is, reality is far from objective. Can you name a single thing that exists independent of your observation? Such a thing does not exist. When you and I meet, you and I come into existence. Until that point, there is no you and there is no I. You exist only in your relation to that which surrounds you. Your very physical form is held together, as mine is in this smoke, by the pressure inside of your skin meeting the pressure outside of your skin, and both forces holding you in one piece. This is a type and a shadow of the whole of existence. Only through the application of various forces of pressure does anything exist. You have learned to master some of these pressure systems and can apply them to summoning something forth from nothingness to speak to you. You ask if I am real? I am as real as the world around you, which is not real at all. Yeah, I love that answer. But so my question is, what are your comments on these statements, and does anything exist when it is not being observed or considered? I think quantum mechanics suggests maybe no. And do you think there are these beings that exist independently from us, or are they all phantoms of our collective imagination, so to speak? But before you answer that, Dean, let me talk to the viewers. To show your appreciation for all the time me and Dean put into this video, please hit that like button and share this video on social media. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you wish to support me, check out patreon.com/Aron Bijl or go to I'mJustGonnaSayIt.com. If you want to buy the book Real Magic, there is a link in the description. If you use that link, part of Amazon's proceeds go to us, so you will support the channel without any extra cost, in addition to buying a very interesting read. I can attest to that. Now back to Dean Radin.
Well, the commentary is in some ways a restatement of idealism, right? The only thing that you can know, or that anything that can be known, is through your awareness. In which case, if your awareness in some literal sense, at least from an idealist perspective, is creating. It's the process of creation, and it's being recreated constantly all the time. So that it may well be true. Like whatever it was that spoke that phrase, sounds like idealism manifesting into words. It may well be true, but on the other hand, as embodied beings, if you take that very, very seriously, it'll probably drive you mad. Yeah. Because you can't operate as a psychologically healthy person within the material world, which we may have collectively created in some way, but nevertheless, we're still here. It has its own boundaries and constraints. So it's, you know, in the olden days when people could be magicians and live in that world, and then it wasn't as technologically as complicated as it is today, maybe you could get away by living those statements. Today, for most people, it'd be very difficult, I think, you almost have to become schizophrenic in a sense, where you go to work, you do your thing, you pay your taxes, whatever, and you're a normal human being, and then at night, you become something completely different. Or if you go to a temple or something, you know, where you go into a different way of being in order to be able to accommodate those kinds of comments, because they sound crazy. Yeah. Compared to the news in the US now that our president, of course, is pushing hydroxychloroquine as a treatment for COVID. And the other day there was a doctor who gave a rant, basically saying that it's a cure. It's a cure for COVID. You could take this stuff and it's a cure. And she repeats this again and again. And then the media found that the same lady says that that things like gynecological diseases are caused by demons who have sex with men and with women. Okay. And other things which sound crazy. Yeah. And as a result, what the media, all of the media basically are doing is saying, well, see, our president is accepting the word of someone who is a nut, who's talking in these terms. But you see, all you need to do is put on a slightly different hat and say, well, actually, yeah, some of what she's saying is correct. You cannot say that and be taken seriously in the Western world. No, that's for sure. And of course, this lady, I think she comes from Ghana or someplace where it is more like that's within the culture, but at least within the Western world, that's insane. Yeah. So
she's with America's Frontline Doctors or something, right? I think I saw what.
Well, yeah. So yes, so that was taken down by Twitter and Facebook and so on as being crazy. Yeah. And in some respects, it does sound kind of crazy, right? So if whatever we might think of what COVID is or where it came from or anything else, if you talk about it in those terms, you're going to be attacked. Yeah. And so, and very similarly then, if you're a normal person and you go to work in a bank or something and you start talking about magic, you're not going to have that job for very long. So
No.
you're forced to split what you believe and what you do.
Yeah, that's definitely true. By the way, on a side note, she refers to a study from 2005, which I have read, which does seem to indicate that it works when combined with zinc and antibiotics. Why are they lying about this basically?
Yeah, no, it's true that if you look in the scientific literature, you can find some studies that are in favor of it. It's like it's not a cure by any means, but it reduces mortality,
Yeah.
and other ones say it doesn't. So it's not as clear cut as is usually portrayed.
No, it's obviously somebody's lying, but we're gonna find out eventually who it is, I
Well,
guess.
I wouldn't put it that strongly. I wouldn't say it's lying. I would say that at least within the U.S., that when the FDA and the doctors who are the spokespeople are very conservative, because among other things, they want to be able to say, like when we're doing trials now in vaccines with 30,000 people involved. Well, that gives you a pretty good database in which to say, well, are there side effects? Is it dangerous? All the rest. Because if you're going to start injecting 350 million people in the United States with this stuff, you'll be pretty darn sure what's going to happen. And so we don't have anywhere near that kind of confidence in drugs that are supposedly able to help with COVID.
No, that's true for sure.
And all you need is one person to die taking it, which is going to happen just by chance.
Yeah.
And you know it'll blow up. So the conservatism there kind of makes sense.
True, definitely. And going back to the idealism thing, the biggest problem with it, I think, is that it's kind of unfalsifiable in a way, and probably will remain so forever. Because if you take it like for 100% true, then whatever you expect will happen, or at least stuff will go in that direction, as the experimenter effect also suggests.
Well, yes, and that is the epistemological conundrum faced by parapsychology.
Yeah. Well,
So some people get better results than others. It almost doesn't matter what the design is. It doesn't matter what anything is. You'll get the result that you want. And that's what prompted Rex Stanford years ago in the 70s. Was a well-known parapsychologist at the time. The title of one of his better-known papers was, "Are we scientists or shaman?"
that's a nice way of putting
And
it. Yeah.
and so he was arguing that we're scientists, of course. I would argue that we're a little bit of both. We're essentially doing shamanistic things using scientific practices, but we can't deny, I think, the effect that there is an experimenter effect. We see goal-directed effects all the time, and it makes it very difficult then to interpret from a conventional perspective about what's happening. Whereas if, as you said, if you go into an idealist perspective where you're creating whatever you want, you can make an experiment show anything that you wanted to show. And then, then you don't know what's true.
Has the experimenter effect also been shown to exist outside of parapsychological experiments, by the way, or?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in conventional psychology is called the experimenter expectancy effect. And it saturates everywhere in all of science.
So in a
I
way,
mean, of course, we have techniques to try to get around it, of course. The double blinds and placebos and all of that, those are designed to get around it. But if it is really true, you cannot get around it.
no, that's what I suspect. In which case, science will have to redefine itself in a way.
Science is always advancing, right? Instruments, methods, everything are always advancing. And I think that if it is true, which I suspect it is true, that something like idealism is the way things are, then science will eventually have to come to grips with it. And we may be a century away from that now, but eventually we're going to start bumping up against it. And this also is one of the reasons why there are always scientific debates over effects that are at the edge of science.
Yeah.
Because it may well be that the effects are being modulated by the beliefs of the investigators. And so there's no clear answer.
Recently, and I asked him if it was if the double slit experiment had ever been performed without looking at the results, so to speak, without looking at whether it went through the left or the right slit. I mean,
You mean from a conventional perspective?
So where a situation where you would observe, but you don't look at the results of those observations, basically, to see if it still collapses the wave or not.
I think, I'm not positive about this, but I think that if there is a detector that is actually detecting where it is, that even if you don't look, you will not get an interference pattern.
Okay.
That if in principle you could have known, then it will so-called collapse the wave function.
And I've even heard that it's been like replicated now with above quantum particles, like molecules even, or
Yeah, yeah, up to, I think the biggest is a buckyball, carbon 60.
Okay.
So those, those in molecular terms are pretty big.
Yeah, definitely. And well, I imagine it does work on all levels actually, but probably the bigger you get, the harder it becomes or something to do it or to prove it.
Yes, because the more complex the system is, the easier it is to be interfered with by the environment, and that will collapse it immediately. So it's just difficult to get large objects into a superposition, essentially, which would allow you to shove it through two different places at the same time.
Yeah.
fascinating. Yeah, definitely. It boggles the mind. What are you working on at the moment? You still experimenting or focusing more on writing these days?
Much of my work is analytical now. It's we did a whole bunch of experiments, and I have around 8 papers that I'm working on, which is partly analysis, but also writing up the results of the study. Now, I think that's most interest to me is related to the Global Consciousness Project. So this is the network of random number generators that are in cities around the world, and we've been collecting data for 23 years now. So we have a continuous record of truly random bits over 23 years, and it's many, many trillions of bits involved in this thing. And the formal experiment in that study was 500 events, global events, 9/11, terrorist attacks, all kinds of things. Those 500 events, when you look at it in the aggregate, gives you a 7 sigma result. So the odds against chance is around 3 trillion to 1. And if you think then about what's happening, we have this random walk that's been going for 23 years with a lot of data behind it. And when you get a 7 sigma result, it means that of the 500 points along this graph, which is a huge long thing, 500 points deviate a little bit. It's like you're pulling out portions of the random walk where it's stepping up a little bit, and you just keep doing that. In each case, it may or may not be a statistically significant independent event, but they all tend to be in the same direction. That's why when you look at the results over time, you just get this curve that keeps deviating further and further away. There's no reason to expect that it would ever stop if we didn't stop the experiment. So what that means, again, is you go back to the random walk and you have these little peaks, and somehow those little peaks are associated with large-scale events in the world. Okay, so now what the next question that arises sometimes is, well, what about all of the other events that you didn't look at? Right? There's countless numbers of small groups and large groups doing things that are creating the equivalent of mental coherence, right? Like a daily meditation and Chinese New Year's and all kinds of things are happening that were not part of what we were looking at formally. And what happened to that? And the answer is we don't know, because that wasn't part of the experiment. But I figured out an analytical way of testing that idea, which has to do with going back and looking at the actual deviations in the random walk. And in a method that I'm in the process of describing now, because I've already done the analysis, it looks very much like what seems to be a random walk is partially random, but actually much smaller degree of randomness than we thought. And a lot of what looks random actually isn't. It's being modulated by all of these small and large groups that were doing things which were below our radar. We didn't see them, but nevertheless, we're in fact modulating the randomness for 23 years. And the implication of this is that Einstein's objection to quantum mechanics was that God does not play dice. And that's very much what this is looking like. This should be totally random with no connection to anything. And yet the Global Consciousness Project says, well, it does appear to be connected to something, namely coherent consciousness. And what I'm seeing now is also connected to a whole bunch more that we weren't paying attention to.
That reminds me of a quote from the Kybalion, actually, from Hermetics. Randomness does not exist, it's just a law we haven't discovered yet.
Yeah, that's what the implication here is. And of course, if it is true, then it's extremely important, because the idea that we live in a random universe it quickly leads to the philosophy of nihilism.
Agreed. Yeah.
And if we're not living in a nihilistic universe, the opposite is going to be a purposeful universe. And that is a completely different way of thinking about the nature of reality. So that's why this is intellectually an interesting exercise, but the implications of it, if it's true, are really profound.
Definitely. Yeah, in relation to that, I also made an episode recently about the illusion of free will, because I do think that is an illusion if you look at it from a cause and effect perspective, at least.
Yep.
Either it's that or it's random, and in both cases, yeah, we have little to do with it. So.
Well, so my take on free will is that we have micro free will. We can make decisions about am I going to have tea or coffee?
Yeah.
Now, like that, the implications of that in terms of the universe are so small that it doesn't care, it doesn't matter. But those are micro decisions. Macro decisions may not be so free will, but that is not surprising, because after all, what we end up doing for our profession and who we are and the rest, huge amount is pushed by genetics, by culture, by training, predilection, and so on. So we're not really all that free.
No, I agree. It's I always say we do have a choice, but the choice we're gonna make is set in a way, but we just don't know it yet.
Except maybe for micro decisions. Like, I'm not sure I mean, maybe it's possibly that if you, as I think of it now, it may be actually a lot of it is predetermined. Like, if I go in to get an ice cream, I'm not going to pick it at random. I'm going to pick based on what feels good to me, based on memory and a bunch of other things. So I think people actually do become very predictable after a while, and that, after all, is what Facebook and all the other places are doing. Exactly. And they start tracking what you're interested in. It's customized for you.
Oh, yeah, they know what you will buy before you know yourself. It's creepy.
Well, I've noticed on sites that provide, like Google ads, that not only are they tracking what I have looked at, but oftentimes they project into what they think I might be interested in, and half the time they're right.
Yeah.
So, there's a profile of what I'm interested in, and it says, oh, well, if you like this, you probably would like this too. And that's correct.
It's pretty scary how good they are getting at that, definitely.
Have you heard of the AlphaGo program?
The AlphaGo?
Yeah, that's where Google DeepMind beat a person at the Chinese game of Go, with all the white and black stones, and supposedly more moves than stars in the universe or whatever.
Yeah.
And they claim that because the machine was able to win that's kind of proof that AI now has intuition in a way, because it was just too much information to do all the calculations by brute force.
Well, I don't think it was brute force, right? No. So even the chess games now, they're not brute force. They're using a combination of algorithms and learning about the opponent. So it narrows down the stars in the universe very quickly into a much smaller space.
That's true, yeah, and I think he won in the best of 5 game 4-1, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
They're now working on a program to do the same with StarCraft, the PC game, which is even tougher, because the problem space is way bigger because of the amount of moves and possibilities in that game, and the speed at which it takes place as well.
Yeah, will generalized AI eventually become smarter than we are? I think it's inevitable. So the fears about the singularity, when the robots wake up, I don't know. I mean, it's easy to become paranoid about basically everything now. Some of the paranoia is justified and some of it isn't. We hope that our robot overlords are kind to us. Unfortunately, the programmers who are making these things tend not to necessarily be the most compassionate people. So at least I hope that places like Google and others that are developing these things have ethicists on board, or at least think about these issues. Like, if we were able to create a robotic creature or an android that was a lot smarter than we are, what else should we put into it other than raw intelligence?
Actually, in a way, they already outdo us. I mean, there are already programs which outdiagnose physicians when it comes to stuff like schizophrenia, for instance, which is notoriously hard to diagnose.
Right.
Yeah, so there's a lot to learn there, I think. The whole problem, of course, is the black box thing with AI. You can't really tell how they got to their conclusions yet, or they can't tell us.
Right. So I think about this every so often when I'm struggling with trying to understand something that's difficult. And then I say, this is exactly the same thing as my trying to discuss quantum mechanics with my dog. My dog wants to understand, but it doesn't have the capacity to.
Yeah.
And I think, like, when we try to understand, well, what is the nature of reality? Even simpler, how does psi work? We don't have the capacity to be able to understand the answer, even if somebody gave us the answer. We still wouldn't be able to grasp it. Whereas an AI might, in which case the problem of understanding what it learned is really difficult because it may not be able to simplify it to the extent that any human being can actually understand it.
No, that's right. Although if Elon Musk has anything to do with it, that's going to change soon, I think. By the end of this year, his Neuralink program is supposed to bring out the first human with a chip interface in his brain. So
we'll see.
Yeah, well, indeed we'll see, but it's pretty fast if you ask me. I read a study where they already did the same with they already had a monkey controlling a computer with a chip in his brain.
Yeah, it's a little bit different. The idea of controlling a machine is one thing.
Yeah, of
but
course.
that doesn't make you smarter or improve your memory.
No.
It's when it goes in the other direction and you actually can speed, like you can offload mathematical calculations and instantly become a savant, for example. Well, then now we're talking about something quite different, and we're nowhere near that.
Well, it is a two-way system.
It is a two-way system,
just
but
using
they're
it
just
one
using
way
it one way up till now.
They
I guess
don't
they
really know what to do with the other part of it
yet.
I guess. Because that's
well, a two-way system that involves motor control at this point doesn't make any sense.
No,
right?
of course.
Yeah. So it's more about memory extraction and that sort of thing, and then memory insertion. That's where it becomes a completely different ballgame.
Yeah, that's tricky.
I mean, at this point, we don't even have a very good idea about where memory is, right? So it'd be hard to extract it and then insert it if we don't know where it is.
True. By the way, on that, talking about that, do you believe it's even possible to, for instance, transfer consciousness to a machine? I mean, you hear a lot of people talking about it, but I always wonder, is it even possible? I mean, that's kind of up to the soul if that's going to happen or not.
Well, since we don't know what consciousness is, I don't think we have an answer to that question. It's if we take an idealist perspective, you can't transfer consciousness because it's everywhere all the time anyway. Maybe what you can do is transfer memories or aspects of personality. When we think of consciousness, we immediately start thinking about what it feels like as an individual. But if you dive into that like a mystic would, you realize everything is conscious, right? There's no clear separation between you and it and all the rest of it. In which case, the idea of transferring yourself into a computer, what you really mean is not transferring your awareness, but transferring your memories, personality, and all the rest of it, which you call me.
Yeah.
So it might be possible to gather enough about memory and all the rest and stick it in a computer somewhere, and you would just be aware inside the computer, except you wouldn't be embodied in the same way, so your experience might be radically different. Whereas if you could transfer your memories and all the rest into a robot body, like an android, that was similar to this body, I kind of suspect that you would wake up in this robot body.
It's definitely possible, yeah. Although the creepy thing is you'd never really be sure as an outsider whether you're dealing with a real person or just a copy of him.
Even the individual doesn't know.
No,
right?
No, in a way, he doesn't.
Yeah, right? I mean, you go to sleep one place and you wake up somewhere else. It could be a different body, you don't know.
Yeah. I remember the first time I went into virtual reality. It really made me realize a lot about this subject and how tentative this whole experience really is. And I mean, we can't even be sure this is real in a way.
Yeah, that's why people should not spend too much time in virtual reality unless they have the luxury of being able to live in it, right? Because it's true, you transfer almost instantly. And as virtual reality gets better and better, you will definitely find people who want to live in there all the time. And maybe they'll even have jobs and stuff in there. So there's a lot of science fiction scenarios which are based on that idea, and I think that's a forecast of what's actually going to happen, provided that we survive climate change and all the rest. Because there's a case can be made that the combination of climate change, emergence of new viruses, and all the rest, it could push back progress by thousands of years pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's a possibility. Although things are headed that way, I can see it helping our evolution as well, depending on us and how we use it. Time will tell. I think it's about time to wrap it up for now, Dean, although I could talk forever. It was super interesting. Thank you very much for the interview, first of all, and good luck with everything. Do you plan on bringing out a new book anytime soon, or?
I'm currently working with a scholar in Germany on a book on practical magic.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so the idea is there are lots of people doing various kinds of ceremonial magic around the world, in groups and individuals. And there's very little known about not only what people are doing, but what works for them. Like what works, and then why do you think that it works? So we're doing a big survey where among magicians to find out what they do, why does it work, what's their experience with it, and so on. With the idea of coming out with a book that is partially scholarly look at practices throughout history, but also a more contemporary look at, first of all, how many people are doing this. We don't have a very good idea, and what are they doing? So, maybe it turns out that it's mostly affirmations, or maybe, who knows what it is. They're using grimoires or whatever, but at least we're going to find out. So that'll become the core of the new book.
Yeah, it depends also on to what extent you include people. I mean, law of attraction people, for instance, do you consider them practicers as well, or?
I would say yes. That it's all part of the same game. Some of it is much more formalized and whatever, but the core of it is similar. True. So of course we'll split out the way that these things are portrayed, because there are a lot of people within religious contexts are doing magical practices, and they would absolutely insist that they're not doing magic, especially if they're Catholic, because it's prohibited. But that's exactly what they're doing. They just have different names for it.
Yeah, most Catholic masses are in a way rituals. So
the Eucharist is explicitly a magical practice.
Yeah.
I mean, it hasn't changed for thousands of years, and it is magic. It's exactly what magic is about.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's what I find so funny also about organized religion these days. But anyway.
If you need people to interview, you know who to call.
When we have the questionnaire ready to go, we will broadcast it widely.
Oh, okay.
We're curious to see what we're going to get.
Super.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's it then. Thank you very much once again, and enjoy the rest of your day. I hope everything is stable in your area of the United States. You still in Petaluma?
No, I live in Idaho now.
Okay.
So it's a rural state near the Rocky Mountains, and in Republican government. And the Republicans, for some reason, apparently don't believe in viruses or something. So up until recently, we were pretty isolated, and there weren't very many cases. But now it is exploding.
Okay.
So, we're part of the western and southern U.S. as well. It's exploding in terms of number of cases, and we're now we don't have as big a population as California, so it's not as bad as there, but it's not good either.
But at least you're far away from all the protesting stuff and.
Oh yeah, no. I live north of Boise, which is the capital city, and so we're not in the midst of that at all.
Well, that's good.
Now again, thanks for being a guest on the show, and until the next time, maybe.
Very much.
Bye-bye, Dean.
Bye-bye.
Sure. Bye.
So that wraps up our episode for today. Hope you all enjoyed that. Join me again next week for another E for E, Evidence for Extraterrestrials. The week after will be another Spirit Seekers. Until then, keep meditating, stay nice to one another, and get into magic, I guess. Aloha kaku, bye bye.